going to be talking, I think Anil's conversation about the loss of the public online, I think flows really nicely into Adam's work about the loss of the public will change the public in the real world.
Thanks. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's the framing that I want to approach this from, the sort of being burden of everything we've been discussing for the last half hour or so. I want to talk more about, instead of publics on the network, I want to talk about what happens when the network begins to infiltrate traditionally understood public space. And particularly in a context, I run a shop that we do a lot of work in the context of what we think of as the networked city, which is not a science fictional place at all. As a matter of fact, we argue constantly that we already live in a networked city, in a place where everything around us is very dramatically infiltrated by objects and services which are in the process of attempting to gather information about us. We live in a place where there's a pervasively, even a comprehensively instrumented population. I was at Nokia up until fairly recently, and toward the end of my sojourn there, we were approaching an envelope in which you could essentially get smartphone capability out there in the world, bill of materials, something like 20 or 30 euros. So we're really talking about something on the order of 5 billion people over the next couple of years being able to be personally instrumented with some pretty dramatic capabilities to gather and contextualize information. We live in a world increasingly where there's a widespread adoption of locative and declarative media. I don't need to tell anybody in this room that things like Foursquare permit the interpretive analytics to be performed on the data that these services produce as a matter of course. Even sentiment analysis and the things that we do declare in these environments. And increasingly as well, we live in cities that are populated by declarative objects. This is one of my favorite projects from a couple of years ago where a London designer gave Tower Bridge its own Twitter account and allowed it to speak to the world in a voice and register very much approximated the way that we would speak to each other. So the bridge itself is speaking to you, to a public, in a way that you might among your friends and your network of associates. Finally, we live in a place where most of the objects and spaces around us have been provided with informational identities, what I think is informational shadows. So, if we live in a world where our public spaces are increasingly populated with objects that are capable of gathering, processing, displaying, transmitting, and or taking action on information, and particularly where new modes of surveillance have been made possible that do not always or even necessarily operate the visual register, my argument is this, that the tens of millions of people worldwide are minimally exposed to these conditions. Perhaps it's time for a new theory and probably even a new jurisprudence of what I call public objects to help us guide how we think about them. And at a deeper level, what it might mean to speak of a right to the commons. And following on to some of the folks thinking about the right to the city. What does that right to the city imply in a space that's so comprehensively networked? And what I want to begin talking about is what I think of as a spectrum of concern. I'm going to talk very concretely about 4 different kinds of objects and services that have been deployed in cities around the world over the last year or so, 2 years at this point. And I want to begin picking apart some of their implications for this sense of publicity versus privacy. And I very deliberately arrayed them as a continuum. They start from a system that for me is not really at all problematic and in fact is socially beneficial. And we taper up towards a system that I would argue does reasonably profound harm without delivering any public benefit. The first system I want to talk about is this. This is something called the Havana Galki traffic sensor, made by a Finnish company. It is a local radio network. This is something that is superimposed over a traffic pole or a lamp post. And it's got a motion detector. And if it detects the motion of pedestrians or bicyclists in an intersection, it shines a very, very bright LED into the oncoming traffic, notifying them of the fact that there's somebody with a bicycle or somebody about to cross an intersection. And this is, of course, very, very useful in the north of Finland, where it's dark 27 months of the year, 32 hours a day. It's just really, it's a very, very dangerous environment for pedestrians up there. Louder? Sorry, thank you. And even though this is collecting information from public space and is sharing it over a local network, I find it relatively unproblematic. This doesn't really ruffle my feathers in any meaningful way. And I attempted to think about why that is. There's definitely that it's a local collection of information for local effect. It never really leaves that region. There are no analytics that are performed on this information. There's nothing to tie it back to a person. There's nothing to tie it back to a sense of identity. And even more importantly, there's a demonstrable public good that arises out of this. The only real argument that you could make about this system, if you were opposed to it, was essentially an ROI argument. That it costs a certain amount of money to deploy this system, and how many lives are you really going to save by doing it that way? And I don't think that argument really stands up, but that is something that you could, if you were inclined to object to the presence of the system in public space, you could probably levy that argument against it. So I think that this kind of collection of information where, again, it's purely local and it isn't tied to identity in any meaningful way, I don't find that really troubling. Then we begin to get to something like this. This is an ad that was in the Shinto station of the Seoul subway a couple of years ago. And what's happened is that a red carpet has been run through the corridor of the subway, and there are motion sensors underneath that carpet from about here to about here. And when you walk in front of this Nikon ad, you trigger the motion sensors, and the paparazzi in the ad, their flashes go off. And the idea of the ad is obviously supposed to be to make you feel pretty special. You're supposed to feel like a celebrity when you're engaging with this. So again, not a particularly harmful system. There's a local collection of information for local effect. It's not tied to your identity in any way. It's not gathered. It's not archived. There's no analytics that are performed on it. But it doesn't have that fig leaf of public good. It's for purely commercial purposes, and I would even argue that this is mildly disruptive or disrespectful. This guy doesn't look like he's a superstar to me. He looks like he's been shocked out of his state of mind. And so, if that's the worst thing you can say about it, that's really not that bad. We've definitely dealt with voice from advertising before. But you can see how we're beginning to get into this gradient where we're losing the things that made this okay, and we're beginning to layer onto the situation things that make it feel less good to me. Here we get into something really interesting. This is a vending machine by a Tokyo-based designer that was deployed on subway platforms and the train platforms of JR East, the Japan Railway Company. This is a vending machine called Akude, and this made the rounds of the design blogs over the last year because, frankly, it's got an absolutely beautiful HD touch surface on it. The entire front of the vending machine is an HD screen, and these beautiful high-resolution images of the products that are contained within it. And the really interesting thing about Akude, from my perspective, is that it's equipped with sensors that begin. It's got cameras. It's got a facial analytics algorithm that's built into it. And what it's attempting to do as you approach the machine is ascertain your age and your gender, and then offer you a selection of beverages that has been calibrated to appeal to a model of people that have that age and gender. And I begin to find this less happy because it's making prescriptive and normative assertions about what is appropriate for a 43-year-old man or a 24-year-old woman to desire. And what's even worse than that for me is that all the Akude vending machines are connected with one another and with the vending company itself. So they begin to even make orders for the beverages that they're going to bring to market over the next couple of years based on the patterns of what people are buying. It seems innocuous enough, but there is that insidious element, or insidious to me, about being told what we should desire and having the market in real time begin to fold itself around that very gendered, very age-based construction of what I should desire. Here the information is escaping this particular sensor installation. Here the information is being drawn off into a database. Here the information is being mined for commercial value. And there are at least enough signatures that are associated with the connection of that information to begin to tie it back to individual identity. And here's where it gets a little scary for me. In my presentation of this information over the last several years, the reaction has gone from, okay, but you're really talking about depersonalization, and you're talking about information databases that have been scrubbed of any personal traces. The audiences have gotten increasingly sophisticated about this, and what I've begun to hear is that the state of the art is that there's essentially no such thing as a depersonalized database anymore. That with relational databases being what they are, if there is a signature that correlates to your personal identity that's out there and that's available, you can begin to correlate that to other patterns of fact in the world that return to you in some pretty damning ways. So this is really beginning to raise my hackles. Not nearly so much as this last system I want to talk about, which is something called Kividi Video Reports. This is a back-end analytics package which is sold as part of a solution. So this is for a video billboard that's to be deployed in public space. And in the frame of the billboard is a camera, and again, there are the typical sensors and the analytics packages at the back end that can not merely assert to identify your age range within 4 bands, your gender, whether you're male or female. It will begin to use 81 indices of facial bone structure to make some stabs about your ethnicity. And on top of that, it will shine a light off your eyeballs and use a reflectivity index to attempt to determine whether you're paying attention to the content or not. Now, this really begins to irritate me for a couple of reasons. I feel like this is like mining commercially valuable information from public space in a way that doesn't return the value that's been derived from that attempt to harvest back to the people who generated it in the first place. Here's why I think that. The people walking by the billboard in the distance who don't react to it at all are actually furnishing community with commercially valuable data. They're basically, that is an absolutely valuable piece of information to have for an advertiser, that whatever I'm putting on the screen hasn't managed to retain the attention of the people walking past it. So this is essentially, albeit passively, deriving meaningful, financially salient data from our activities in public place without our knowledge, without our consent, and in a way, again, given all of the parameters of personally identificatory information that are associated with this, in ways that definitely come back to lodge against our identity. I think that the situation is more complicated than that still, though, because we've so far been talking about discrete objects. And it's got to be one of my concerns to think about when power knowledge like this, it resides not in a discrete physical object itself, but in an ensemble of related things. This is an access control system in Barcelona, which is gathering information from an embedded sensor grid over there, but there are other components to the system as well. There's the network bollard itself here, which rises to block traffic through the area. There is an RFID touch plate over there with a keypad. There is a system of lighting and signage and nomenclature that surrounds this object and gives its effect in practice, in function, in physicality, and in law. And again, if you're going to object to this, you can't object to any one of these components. If you think about them as components, the power knowledge doesn't really live in any one of them itself. It's only when you bring these things together that they have that kind of effect on public space. And things get even foggier when power knowledge resides in code. This is something that my wife and I learned when we were doing a series of walking tours of cities around the world devoted towards exploring the impact of information gathering in public space. We were told a story in Wellington, New Zealand about a system of CCTV cameras that had been installed by the city there. And the city had actually put the question of whether or not to install these cameras to a public referendum. And the state justification for it was traffic safety. Again, this was protecting the rights, the health, and the security of the people in the city. And when put forth in that way, under the guise of being about the regulation of traffic and protection of children and other people, the referendum was overwhelmingly favorable, passed immediately, the cameras were authorized, the cameras were installed. The next year after that, a new software package became available for the interpretation of imagery coming from those cameras. They were repurposed and turned to the uses of the police department who wanted to use them for facial recognition and to track the movement of known individuals through public space in Wellington. Now, what's interesting to me about that is that the object is remaining identical. The camera has no new capability itself. It's been endowed with a new generation of capability through the new version of software that's been deployed at the back end. And that deployment was never put to a public referendum. So even to somebody like me, it feels really strange to ask her, well, every time you want to upgrade your cameras, are you going to put that question to a public referendum or not? That feels like a pretty strange question to me. So I don't know exactly what to do about this situation. I think that we can take a stab at defining and even regulating around the presence of discrete objects in public space that gather information. And to that end, we've begun to articulate a definition of something we think of as a public object. And this definition goes back to 2000. Any discrete object in the common spatial domain that's intended for the use and enjoyment of the general public. Any artifact that's located in or bounding upon the public right-of-way. And any discrete object which is de facto shared by and accessible to the public, regardless of its ownership or original intention. Having defined things that way, I think, then we can begin to have public discussions about them in all of the communities in which these things exist, and begin to bring to the surface some of the very profound questions that exist around them. I would argue that we need to actually put brackets around how we can construct the presence of these things in our public spaces, with the aims of resisting concentrations and asymmetries of network-derived power knowledge, resisting capture of the commons by private interest, and ensuring that where the public generates data, the public has meaningful access to and ownership of that data in a way that benefits it and not a private party. And that is what I wanted to offer you today.
Right, as per usual, while Keiichi is coming up to install, has anyone got any questions for Adam? I'll let them manipulate their devices briefly first. Oh, how's everyone doing? You all look lovely. Any questions for Adam? Anyone here?
I think that was really, thank you so much. I think it's great, but where should we start? Should we start in lawmaking and policy? I think it's a giant thing to try to tackle. Where would you start?
I start as a New Yorker. I start with New York City Council. I start with trying to raise these issues and bring them onto the radar of the people who I've empowered to speak for me this year. I agree with you. It's a giant question, and I can guarantee you that these questions are not particularly on the radar of my elected representatives. They, with a sole exception, they've kind of drawn a blank when you call their office, and even in very, very high-level language, try to present this to them and say that this is something that you should be thinking about because it's already affecting your constituents and will certainly affect your constituents in years to come. We've begun to get some traction, and ultimately, it's difficult for me because I speak on behalf of a company that's developing software and services in this domain, but also as a citizen and an advocate. And what I'd like to see is regulation around information collection in public spaces. What I'd like to see is regulation that protects my right, and to some degree an assumption, whether it's fair or not, around anonymity in public space that has characterized big cities since the dawn of big cities. We're beginning to see some regulatory interest in that. I think that that's a slippery slope, though, and it's going to require that somebody get bitten by this in a pretty big and prominent way before I think it's something of concern to the legislative and regulatory community. Absolutely.
Right, we're having a little trouble here finding the. Do you want to? Yes, it's not showing up very much. One more question?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on if you go into Flickr and search for Barcelona, George Orwell images, you find this nice one.
Yeah, the Plaza de George Orwell in Barcelona. Yeah, that camera actually isn't there anymore. It's been moved. Yeah, because of all of those pictures of the sign.